Well, good afternoon. My name is Maria Brown Spence, and if you are here for the Youth Mental Health Crisis panel, then you are in the correct place. So I'll start with a brief introduction. I'm the manager for member companies with the Entrepreneurs Foundation, and so we work with tech companies and startups to build their social impact strategies and how they want to get connected in the communities to increase team building and rapport amongst their teams. I'm also the founder and CEO of an Austin-based nonprofit called Hearts to Heal, which provides mental health and bereavement support to the community. And so this topic is very dear to my heart. I am not a parent, but we do have a mentorship program for Black teen girls that's led by two Black women licensed psychologists. And we've heard a lot of this conversation and topic come up within that group. So we would love to get started. To kick off this discussion, like we said, raise your hands again for how many parents we have in the room. All right. And how difficult has it been navigating the pandemic with children and also working? Raise your hand if it's been difficult. That should be everyone. I do not have children. I had a dog, and that was already hard enough for me, but did not have to worry about some of the same aspects of it. So I did want to start with something that was just released last Thursday. So the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention is warning of an accelerating mental health crisis among adolescents, with more than 4 in 10 teens reporting that they feel persistently sad or hopeless, and 1 in 5 saying they have contemplated suicide, according to the results of a survey just published last Friday. So we are truly in a mental health crisis when it comes to our youth. So this topic is right on time, unfortunately, but we have an amazing panelist of experts that want to give insight and expertise to help you navigate this challenge. So to kick us off, I'd love to turn it over to Sheila Andrea to get us started with a video clip and share more about herself.
Hi everyone, welcome, thank you. I'm Sheila Andrea and I'm the CEO and co-founder of IndieFlix, which is a global streaming platform of content for purpose. We also have IndieFlix Education, which is where we create social impact films that we take out into corporations, schools. Are you getting feedback? Are you okay? And we create programming around that so we can kind of not only open up the conversation, but keep it going. It has been a very organic process. And I came from Hollywood. I worked on TV shows, The Wonder Years, Party of Five, Dawson's Creek. Never thought I would be making mental health films and taking them into corporations and schools. But a friend of mine had asked me, she said, gosh, you make these films about bullying and empowerment and you take them out into the world, you need to make one about mental health. And I was like, no, I'm not going to do that. I think it needs to be made by a mental health professional. And frankly, I don't think anyone in a school or corporation would want to talk about mental health so openly. And she kept asking me. I worked with her. I saw her every week. And then I got a call on New Year's morning that she had died by suicide, leaving 2 teenage children and a husband behind. And I knew she was struggling, but I didn't know that it was that bad. And I think that's a really common statement that a lot of us make. And so I made Angst, which is the first in what used to be a trilogy, but now it's a collection of 4 mental health films. And just out of curiosity, this is kind of how I start things off when I'm in the corporate settings or classrooms or auditoriums, is raise your hand if you or someone you know has ever been, experienced the negative effects of either extreme anxiety or an anxiety disorder. Okay, good. When you're in a room with like 2,000 people, it is the most powerful and yet at the same time there's so much solidarity in knowing that we're not alone, and yet we don't talk about it. So I've made Angst, which I'm going to actually show you 2 clips. One is really about how anxiety doesn't discriminate, and then we'll do a second one basically on just a minute about the science around it.
Anxiety doesn't discriminate. It affects us whether we live in a big town or a small city. It affects us if we're male or female, all gender, all races, everything.
I'm an immigrant, and my future is a little blurry at the moment, and it's just scary.
I have like friends personally who feel that they have like no choice whatsoever. Like they're like into like gangs and like they're in the streets and they feel like based on the family that I'm growing up in, like the block I live on or whatnot, I have to do this.
Everyone's dealing with some form of anxiety, part of the human experience. Johnny from an underserved community, he may not see his parents because they're locked up or they're using drugs or they're just out and about all the time. But Johnny from the affluent family, he may not see his parents either because they're working all the time. And then you have the extra expectations that these affluent kids have as well. You know, you come from a good home, you're supposed to do well.
It's very, very common that the expectation is just you're going to college, point blank. There's no give and take with that. That creates a lot of stress for young people.
In the old days, people didn't talk about college starting in 3rd grade. You shouldn't even think about college in 3rd and 5th grade. But I've seen little kids in my practice who literally have it monster under my bed and I'm afraid that I won't ever get into college. I'm going, where did they get this?
Definitely meeting up to your parents' expectations.
I'm behind the curve because I'm doing 2 APs instead of 3.
What you're gonna do for the next 4 years, like, it's kind of hard.
You know, just this feeling I get when I'm, thinking about colleges, I just start to get a little worried and then it just becomes more and more dramatic over the next hour, the next 2 hours. And my head just gets cloudier and cloudier with all these different thoughts and worries. And so I get to this climax where my head is just buzzing and I'm just like, looking around and I'm just kind of trying to figure out what's going on almost. And at that point, I just have to drop everything I'm doing, go get a glass of water or something and just kind of try to calm myself down.
It almost feels like this generation is feeling the most amount of stress, which I know is probably not true, and definitely the generations that came before my generation felt stress too. It's just, I think that people are talking about it more.
Yeah, we're better at identifying anxiety and depression. Anxiety is something everyone feels, and I think we are better now at determining what causes an anxiety disorder versus having more of just plain anxiety.
So that was, that we break the film up into chapters so that we've learned that people like to have access to those chapters again and then discussion points. So who knew we were going to make a movie that was so evergreen and chopped up into little pieces. Now we have just a little 1-minute clip about just a little bit of the science about what not just our kids can deal with, but us as well.
It's very common for kids to not know, and even more common for parents to not be able to recognize that anxiety is the reason they're struggling so much.
I would go to the nurse and they would send me home because I just had these horrible stomach aches and no one could figure out what it was for a really long time. And then I'd be super nervous and anxious about all the school I was missing, and then they would get worse.
I can't tell you how many times I will tell a family the reason why your kid has chronic abdominal pain is because they are too anxious about school, or they're so worried about how they're going to do at the basketball game, or they're scared that their parents are going to be deported, and that's why their stomach hurts. And that's a big leap if you think about it. How can that possibly have anything to do with the brain and the stomach? But it does. Because if you think about it physiologically, that if you create a chronic stressful condition, worrying, that raises your cortisol level, which is our internal steroid, which raises the amount of hydrochloric acid in our stomach, which is not okay, and your stomach hurts. Your heart starts going faster, your eyes dilate, your mouth gets dry, your hands get cold, your muscles get tight, and if your muscles are tight for a long time, then you start hurting. Your back starts hurting, your shoulders start hurting, your neck starts hurting. If you furrow your brow for too long, you'll start getting a headache. If I explain it that way, like at a very basic physiologic level, people get the aha. They suddenly have a moment of awareness.
So anyway, those are, we have angst, we have like, which deals with social media addiction, we have the upstanders, which is about belonging and resilience, and knowing that we matter. And then the latest one is Race to be Human, which addresses apprehension and sometimes confusion that we feel when talking about race and racism.
Thank you for sharing those clips with us. And so this session is very interactive. So based on those clips, those that acknowledge they are parents, how many have had to have difficult conversations with their children during the pandemic on mental health or anxiety or just how you're feeling, and maybe not even using those terms? And how uncomfortable did that make you feel as a parent to acknowledge that your kids or your youth are struggling? Uncomfortable.
I made a movie about it, and
Yeah.
I'm like deer in the headlights when it's with my own kids, and I'm just like, you know, you're not supposed to rescue and fix. You're supposed to just be there with them, with their stuff, and that's really hard to do as a parent because you want to take away that pain, but it really is the most powerful thing you can do.
And one thing you have to do too is show up to work after you might have had a meltdown in between Zoom calls, right? And so I really like to ask Kathy Farmer, what can you do in the workplace to support parents or those that are caregivers for youth and children, especially while a lot of us are still in home and the hybrid place, and there's really not a way to get away from the children but still have to show up for work?
Thanks for asking the questions, Maria, and also thank you for sharing all the CDC statistics that came out last week, because I think that from the employer perspective, this is not new for us, but now that it's getting as much publicity and headline, it's actually very liberating because it's empowering a broader conversation. So from an employer perspective, why do we get involved in youth mental health? Do those kids come to work? They will before we blink twice. Anybody who's been raising children know how fast it goes. And I'm deeply concerned about a generation of youth that has been through not only the pre-existing stress, anxiety, isolation, and mental health issues that existed before, but now have been exacerbated by the 2 years of the pandemic. If you would practice with me for just one moment, I want you all to think about the fact that we have a number of speakers for this session these days that can't make it because they've got COVID. We had one, Dr. Yusra, she can't make it today because she tested COVID. But we've got some agility now, we've got some resilience. I want you to flash back with me 2 years. I want you all to remember what it felt like when everything shut down. And nobody really knew. And we were all trying to figure it out. I don't know about you, but when my groceries got delivered to the front door, I sat out there and washed them. Does anybody remember that? I know it sounds really crazy right now.
I remember.
Okay. But I want you to get in touch with the anxiety and the uncertainty that we felt as adults who have resources and skills and experience going through challenges and difficult things. And then I want you to move to the kids. What about the kids? Can you imagine what it could be like to be 7 or 8 or 9 years old and have everything that you know stop? That you're no longer going to school, you're no longer playing with your friends, your parents are home all the time. The TV is probably on. And if you're not seeing people dressed head to toe in all kinds of protective garments, you're probably having your kids watch the news and they're seeing trailer trucks of overflow deaths being stored in trucks. I just want you to put that on for a minute because that's the silent epidemic that employers are aware of. And the reason we put this on is because was not being spoken about last year. As everybody was starting to come out of hibernation and come together, we were talking about our own mental health. We were talking about how draining it was to be with people and what stress was going on as we were trying to figure out how to go back to work and things like that. But we weren't talking about what happens to a 7-year-old or a 9-year-old or an 11-year-old who doesn't really have access and a voice to talk about what it feels like to wear a mask, not go to school, be on Zoom. We are starting to see that our United States government has rolled back language expectations for children now. I hope you've all seen that, okay? We're also seeing that reading scores across our nation have dramatically dropped. So to hear that the CDC is saying in adolescents there's a 20% incidence of suicidal thoughts and a 60% reality about anxiety and mental health issues, we should be aware of because there aren't enough resources. And that's where the employer gets in. We were already championing for mental health because we believe in innovation and thriving in creativity. We believe in supporting our employees to be able to unlock that potential in a business environment. And we know that our worker mental health was super important. And we heard clearly and loudly, and not just in the United States, but globally, that the children were suffering. And so when we tried to put resources and tools in our parents' hands, not only for themselves, but for the kids, we found that we're woefully under-resourced as a society and not just in the US, around the world. So the employer role stepping in, and what we're trying to do is, number one, we're trying to reduce the stigma. We're really trying to open up the conversations, and we've really leaned in to our C-suite leaders to be role models and really champion and talk about their own journeys and their own experience to destigmatize. I will tell you, as we had our dinners last night, one of the topics came up about how we were all navigating the pandemic. From my point of view, I will tell you the C-suite was in angst. There's no B-school playbook for when the whole world shuts down. It just wasn't on the shelf. And these leaders trying to balance their business and their employees' needs had their own set of sleepless nights and anxiety and challenges to try to lead. So we have been, as an employer, putting resources and tools into the hands of leaders, not only from themselves, but they can lead their teams. We've been trying to make more and more resources available, and I will just tell you that around the world, this is no different. We have this issue in Belgium, we have this issue in France, we have these issues in Singapore, we have these issues in China and Taiwan and Vietnam. They may be spoken of and dealt with differently because of different cultures, but it's a whole generation of people who are trying to navigate anxiety. And the data that I would share with you is that basically early onset issues are typically resolved in 7 mental health sessions. Unaddressed, they turn into far more serious issues. And the real issue is, how do we get access to support? We're driving, of course, video and telehealth. We're driving different models. And I can speak from my own employer, Levi's, is even before the pandemic, we just basically broke down the walls of what healthcare is delivered in the United States, generally through network providers. And we said, that goes away. Any mental health services that anybody needs, they'll all be paid at in-network coverage, regardless of whether it's an in or out-of-network provider, because there aren't enough. Fast forward to pediatrics, that's even more rare today. So we are partnering with NGOs, nonprofits, resources anywhere where we can to try to be able to put into the hands of our employees and the public at large the resources that we need for our kids.
Question. When you think about building your global total rewards, thank you. I have a loud voice, but I can also use this too. When you think about building out your global total rewards and benefit packages and the programs to support and caregiver benefits, right? Like we're hearing a lot from the McKinseys and Willis Towers Watsons around family care benefits, unlike ever before, and employers leaning in. You have so many to choose from. I'm curious what programs or tools or companies that you're using at Levi around care benefits, and maybe it's like, care.com for childcare, or what are those companies that you think are interesting or paving the way around employee care that's also impacting their families?
So thank you for the question. I would say to you that family care looks different around the world. And the question that you asked about care.com is pretty much more of a US specific, but we absolutely do have a vendor that we use for child and elder care that has other ancillary services, coaching networks, concierge, all for care. But let me take it beyond that, if I may. While that's important, we found that that doesn't really work as well, for example, in some of the Asian cultures, where there's generational culture about who takes care of the family. There can be different social services in some of the European countries. So let me just say that what we found in the pandemic that we learned is an extremely valuable benefit is time. Whether it's personal time with the family or whether it's personal time for yourself. And what we're in the midst of doing right now is driving a core basic minimum around the world that regardless of country or culture, that all of our employees get paid time off, whether it's for deliveries of new children or adoption or fostering, but it's also a secondary caregiver, partners for families, and also, to your point, paid family leave, time to be with the children who are sick or whatever it may be. And we have found that that's a super important mental health aspect also, because time is a very precious resource. But I don't want to take all of the time here because I know that some of my colleagues have also done a lot of work in trying to solve for this crisis, and I wanted to just kind of flip it back to you, Maria, because I know Marty has got a lot of resources to share.
So I want to bring in one more statistic, which is important too, because sometimes you have to hear the data to understand and connect with it. So the CDC survey paints a portrait of a generation reeling from the pandemic, grappling with food insecurity, academic struggles, poor health, and abuse at home. Nearly 30% of the teens surveyed said a parent or other adult in their home lost work during the pandemic, and a quarter struggled with hunger. 2/3 said they had difficulty with schoolwork, which we also know there was a digital divide that took place during that time. But the survey also offers hope, finding that teens who feel connected at school report much lower rates of poor health, and the finding calls attention to the critical role schools can play in a student's mental health. And so as you saw during the pandemic, a lot of parents also had to become educators and instructors while they navigated work. And we saw many children hopping on Zoom calls with C-suite leaders as well, which put another lens to the human dynamic to say, oh gosh, this is a leader just like me navigating the workplace, and the kid hopped on with pajamas. All right, it brought another human level to it. And so I'd really like to ask you, Marty, with you being a parent and the executive director of On Our Sleeves and really having that connection with the youth, how are you supporting your well-being and encouraging others to support their health as they have to navigate this world of being a parent and being an employee or being a colleague? What are some tips that you could give?
Thank you for the question. I'm so glad all of you are here. On Our Sleeves is a national movement for children's mental health and wellness, and it's based on the concept that our kids cannot wear their thoughts and feelings on their sleeves the way we can. They don't yet have the verbal skills, perhaps, or even the understanding, and maybe they're saying it's a stomach ache. So it's up to all of us around them, the adults, the teachers, the coaches, the counselors, the parents, the Girl Scout leaders, all of us, to try to understand a little bit more about what's going on with these children and how we can best help them. It's true that 1 in 5 children, before the pandemic, we knew 1 in 5 children was living with a significantly impairing mental health disorder. And we also know that 50% of lifetime mental illness presents before the age of 14. So On Our Sleeves came to be simply so that when we talk about mental health, we don't forget to talk about the kids. And all of this began before the pandemic. And in 2019, Nationwide Insurance, which is one of our major corporate partners, came to us and said, we really think we need to look at the impact of child mental health on the workplace. And they used the word workplace because in 2019 we all used that. And we were excited about that idea, and we thought, yes, this is something we absolutely want to dig into. Well, fast forward, we never could have known what was coming not only our way, but everybody's way. And so we dove in 2020 to designing some research to better understand this connection. And what we learned is that parents and caregivers overwhelmingly are concerned about their children's mental health and well-being. And we see far more parents citing concern. We see 6 in 10 parents citing concern than our 1 in 5 children with the mental health disorder diagnosis. And so what we know is that the concern group is much bigger than the necessarily diagnosed group. And that could be for many reasons. It could be lack of access. It could be the current trend of what's going on during the pandemic. So what we realized is that more and more parents and caregivers are feeling these worries. And this is not just the stress of, will I make it to daycare pickup in time? Or what if I miss soccer practice? Or, oh my gosh, it was, my day to do the teacher gift and I forgot. This is my child withdrawing into their room and thinking dangerous thoughts? Is my child's misbehavior related to perhaps it's anxiety, perhaps it's worry, perhaps it's unsupported learning needs that don't necessarily fit a mainstream model and certainly don't fit a Zoom model, to your point. And so the worry that parents and caregivers bring then to their work showed up as 30 to 50% of their mental time at work being over here worrying about their child's mental health and well-being and emotional development and behavior. And so our research took us over a year to conduct, and along the way we did some curriculum design with a resource for employers to roll out to parents and caregivers. And it's all available now. It's called The Great Collide is the name of our research report, because that tension we heard so strongly from our respondents. They told us, I feel like an elastic. I feel like a hamster on a wheel. I feel like a juggler. I feel like a ball of spaghetti that I can't get quite untied. And my personal favorite was the air traffic control metaphor. I feel like I'm in the tower directing all the time. And so our research study and our resources that we've been deploying through On Our Sleeves are designed to alleviate some of that distraction. And I am going to answer your question, which is, it's the notion of putting your oxygen mask on first. So at onoursleeves.org, we have all kinds of resources for parents and teachers and coaches to think about and have conversations with kids. But the number one thing we tell everybody is your own self-care has to come first and come alongside. There's so many metaphors, you can't pour from an empty cup and all these kinds of things, but it's really, really true. And I think what we saw during the pandemic is when you take away an adult's coping mechanisms, you take away a child's coping mechanisms, and then you sort of isolate them together. And of course the adults are supposed to model sit and don't solve, listen to their stuff, I think many times we may know what to do, but doing it is a whole nother thing. And there's there's a significant amount of parents and caregivers who don't know what to do, because how many of you feel like you grew up with mental health skill development as part of your upbringing? I call us Generation P for pivot. The people who are parenting right now are trying to, in one generation, turn this around and create a space and learn skills and talk to kids about mental health when it probably never came up, or if it did, it wasn't in like a positive way necessarily in our upbringing. And so we're trying to upskill all the grown-ups who surround our kids. We, of course, want to support them when they need treatment, but you probably know the waiting list to get a child into a therapist is 6 months or more. So we work on what happens in that 6 months. What happens in the 6 months before you even made the call, when you weren't sure if you should make the call because you knew there was a long waiting list, but you're really getting worried. That's our space to try to help parents and caregivers and coaches and teachers so that when they go to work, they can focus and they can and really feel connected.
Thank you for that. Again, I'd like to ask this room too, what are some ways that you develop coping skills or self-care tips that you utilized during the pandemic? Especially like I mentioned, if you had someone that had throw up on their shirt right before you had to hop on a Zoom call and put that face on to deliver a report or give updates to your company. I'd really like to hear from you all. What are some self-care tips that you utilized during the pandemic?
I rode my bike. When the weather was good, go outside and ride around for an hour or two and find other folks who wanted to do the same thing. I don't need for exercise, mental exercise, not physical exercise.
That's good. Physical activity is always good to clear your mind. I know we saw a lot of companies kind of pivot to, for those that lead teams or in management positions, also do maybe walking calls to where you take off of Zoom. And so research showed as well, for every 1 hour you were on Zoom, it was actually 2 hours of mental load. So no wonder you got off a call and you were just exhausted, because that time was actually double. So would anyone else like to share a self-care tip that they utilized during the pandemic?
This is pre-pandemic, but when I was the caregiver for my mom, I asked for a flexible work schedule. And I think that stigma being, or even the ability to change your work schedule from full-time to part-time to full-time, depending on the needs that you have, I think is really special and valuable, and something I think the pandemic has helped employers also reframe that it's okay if an employee needs to decrease their hours or have a different flexible schedule or work at different hours and times or day. And I think that's really unique. Back to your idea of time, and time is so precious. Giving people that flexibility, I think, hopefully is here to stay as well.
Yes.
I'll share mine. This is being very vulnerable. I got medicated, honestly. And so going through, working in HR during the pandemic was just absolutely terrifying, right? And so especially since I shared this with someone at dinner last night, being in HR, my husband and I worked at the same company, and he was on my furlough list, and I was under an NDA and couldn't even share anything with him, right? And so it was just extraordinarily difficult. And I feel like I'm a very strong person, but whenever I started having, talking about that video, right, that pit in your stomach, and I was getting my stomach was just upset all the time. I had massive headaches. I went to the doctor, and she had me fill out, this little chart, and got on Lexapro, honestly. And so that has helped tremendously. I started walking, I work from home remote, but that was the only thing that truly helped. And talking about, destigmatizing getting medicated, right? It's scary for some people, and I used to be really afraid of it, right? But it is night and day, 100% different from last year, so.
Thank you for saying that.
And that's important too, having these open and transparent dialogues. I think we also saw that a lot too from companies that did it very well with their C-suite leaders, to take the forefront and step up to say, this is a struggle for all of us, and here's how I'm struggling, but we'll get through it together. And so even creating that transparency of dialogue is so important. And I'd like to ask you, Sheila, with the films that you're creating as an opportunity to start or evoke dialogue, how can companies empower their employees to step up and take the mic essentially to talk about some of these tough topics?
Well, I think I can speak to just what we've seen in the workplace. And I've already talked to these companies, so they don't mind that I share this. But we did a screening for Starbucks corporate, and at corporate headquarters, and we had about 800 people in the room. And we also, a week later, did a screening at Goldman Sachs with about 800 people in the room, with expert panelists and all that stuff. Starbucks, their culture was slightly different, so there was a lot of sharing about being on medication, getting the whole family into counseling. There was tears, even to the detail of getting the dosage right, like on a medication, but just being vulnerable. Leaders being vulnerable had the most profound effect. It just gave permission for everyone to say, you can show that human side a little bit more at work, because we all know it's there. And then on the at Goldman Sachs, it was much more buttoned up. I think we had like 3 questions in the whole Q&A. And I actually thought maybe we didn't even like push our way through. And sorry, my phone is going off. And I ended up calling the head of wellness later and saying, did it do anything? Was it helpful? She said, yes, we've got more engagement with our EAP. People are sharing in reviews. We're talking in the hallways and in the bathrooms and in the different groups and organizations. And so that was like just being able to talk about it. What people don't realize, and because Dr. Yursa Ben Halim, who is our licensed professional, isn't here, and I used to be at Sundance hanging out with filmmakers. Now I'm at mental health summits hanging out with mental health experts. They're my new best friends. And so I can share a little bit of what they say is that, our brains, I mean, what's really wonderful is there's science behind all of this. And when you're talking, especially when you're able to share, you're tapping into 3 executive functions of the prefrontal cortex. It's an action, you have to move your lips, you have to make a sound, and you have to form a sentence. And doing those 3 things, anxiety can't exist. You move the energy from the amygdala to the prefrontal cortex. And so even if before a presentation, I will recite the months of the year backwards, or I will do something just to trick my brain. Did anyone see Inside Out? Right? What a great movie. Who's in the controls? So when we can start sharing resources, and we know how guardians and parents are, we are like the force, right? Get a few resources going, some tips, things like that. We share with each other because we want, it might help. So when you open up the conversation, it changes corporate culture lickety-split. You can leapfrog. And then be able to tap into resources. You actually can make some meaningful, forward motion.
Thank you so much for that. And yes, we have a question.
Okay, so this is a little more forward-looking, but I teach at-risk youth. I'm an equine therapist. I also recruit people at JDI. My oldest kiddo that I teach is 16, and I have spent 3 years teaching him to recognize the stomach ache as emotions and say the 5 things you see and the 4 things you hear and process through that. And I'm just curious, and it sort of goes to the point that you just made, how do we as a workplace prepare for an incoming generation of, I hope, kids and young adults who are now emotionally aware and more emotionally able to share and want that sort of deeper level connection than we're used to? What does the workplace need to do to welcome that generation, create a space where we foster it as opposed to traditionally, not at JDI, we're perfect, but have shut it down in the past?
I'd like to take that one. So since I'm representing the employers here, what I would say is that we're already seeing that. So Levi's is a progressive organization. They have championed HIV/AIDS in the 70s, research, philanthropy. They've stood for lots of social justice issues over the years, many of them controversial. So why would mental health be a stigma in an organization like that? But I'm telling you, a number of years ago when we tried to tackle this, it really was a stigma issue. And it was really interesting to say that we could talk about anything except mental health. So what I'm finding is that generational difference is changing already. And that with the new workforce that we're hiring in, access to mental health support, open conversation about it, needing to be as part of our work environment is absolutely ongoing. It's at the forefront. And I welcome it because it's refreshing. I often try to say that the only difference between your physical health and your mental health is about 1.5 inches. It's called the neck. That's all it is. But the stigma around it was just crazy. So where we are is we are dialoguing. We are opening up the conversation when we do a filming. We're going to show Angst during the May Mental Health Month. But we're going to kick it off with our CHRO doing a fireside chat, talking about her own mental health journey. And those of all of us, so that we're trying to, again, destigmatize it. But we have to have, the catching receptacles, because once you open up the conversation and people become more activated around recognizing it, then the resources need to be there. And there are lots of different initiatives that are underway. I know, for example, Meta is trying a peer-to-peer approach. It's looking like it's working pretty well for them. Traditional EAPs, yes, they're a resource, but we need to iterate beyond that. Technology is really helping with a lot of the solutions. But I also think that the way we're really going to get there for one another is to just basically mainstream this and make it completely part of our lives. That everybody feels anxiety at some level. Many people have depression at different times. Fear is a natural consequence sometimes just to the reality of the world that we live in. Yesterday, I had a colleague mention to me that their son was feeling a tremendous amount of concern because of a shooting. How many of us have been touched by public or school shootings and violence or crime? Those are very healthy, normal reactions, by the way, to feel fear and anxiety in the face of danger. So these are all really healthy, wonderful things. And I think conferences like this and audiences like this that are engaged, who will then turn around and take this back into your places of research and work and champion for this to become mainstream, is an enormously hopeful opportunity to be able to say everywhere that we can all be whole and healthy and have these conversations, and we can all basically live the lives that we were created to live.
Could I add quickly that I think employers can also really invite the diverse perspectives of what different types of employees and cultures are handling. So in our data, we heard 85% of parents say, yes, it would help me to talk to another adult about my child's mental health. But then we asked them to rank who would they like to talk to. And guess who was at the very bottom? Their boss, their colleagues, and HR. And they were even lower among parents of color, because the lack of trust in those conversations and settings really came through. And so I think there's so much opportunity to really, at dinner last night, we had a great chance to get different perspectives into that conversation in a way that we wouldn't otherwise have done.
And I'd love to touch on that part too, for the recognition of underrepresented or once marginalized demographics as well. With Hearts to Heal, we have what's called the Travis County Girl Squad. It's a mentorship and wellness program for Black teen girls. And this was based on a study from Georgetown University called Adultification Bias that shows, starting at the age of 5, Black girls are seen as needing less care, knowing of more adult topics and not as supported. And so we were able to find 2 licensed Black women psychologists to lead peer support groups to provide mental health education. We received 100 plus applications within 4 days for girls that wanted to attend this program, and were only able to accept 20. During that time, some of the feedback from parents were, my daughter is sharing more than she has ever shared before on some of the things she's experiencing at school. And the mom replied, and now I'm able to share with her to sometimes why I'm snippy after work because I've been stressed out and burnt out. And so really the importance of peer support and mental health education spans beyond any demographic, to really have that connection with lived experiences, to say we have more alike than we think. And that thread really came up during our dinner conversation. And from what we saw taking place over the pandemic, a lot of racial unrest. And I remember one time Eugene got on the phone with me and he said, hey, Maria, just calling to check in. I said, okay. He said, I've seen there's been a lot going on. How are you feeling? And this was with all the police shootings that were taking place. And I just started crying on the phone because I didn't realize how much I had pent up in me, but it also showed a human capacity as well to say, let me pause and let me check on my colleagues, because we are not in a space to where we can go to the water cooler and say, hey, how's it going? Or see someone that might look a little more frazzled at the workplace. If you see someone coming in with their coffee and they're always spunky, you know that it's good to go. And if they're not that way, then you can say, I'm identifying something here. But it was easier for people to put on a mask on the Zoom call or decide to say, I'm just not going to have my video on at all. And so I want to ask you guys too, how can we empower employees to speak up with challenges? Because again, we hear this term psychological safety in the workplace that's trending now, for supervisors and managers to even empower their employees to feel safe to say, I'm struggling and it might be hurting my performance, but I need to let you know. So I'd open that up to anyone on this.
We literally put it on the agenda of our status meetings. There's a section at the bottom and it says, what are you doing in the upcoming week to support your own mental health? And we do a round robin share. And it's not just what are you doing this weekend? It's like, what are you actually doing? Is it riding your bike? Is it, taking your meds on time? Once it's on the agenda, it's like accepted right away. It's like, oh, now it's in writing, and so this is what we do. So I think you could even open meetings that way. I mean, to your point about this emotionally savvy generation coming in with all these vocabulary words, I mean, that's a great way to open up. How are you doing? How are you feeling? How are your families doing? And then being willing to listen.
And I'll jump in there too. We obviously embrace that as well. And then I heard this morning there was a reference to ERGs. And so we're leveraging ERGs very heavily because they're very important organizations. They're if you will, self-affirming, and they're growing exponentially. And I would say that they're a powerful influence on policy and programs because it gives us the opportunity to hear needs and concerns and to address them. Interestingly, there are many of the traditional ones that you might expect. Some of them are nationality driven, some of them are gender, but the largest one we have, interestingly enough, and we've got dozens now, is the families with special needs. We were surprised when we had a C-suite executive who championed that and opened it up. We probably had over 100 people come into the first meetings. And the definition of a family with special needs is really interesting because it's all different perspectives. It's my parents had special needs, or I'm an adult now and it was never recognized and I have special needs, or I have children that need special needs, or I have family members, and special needs is all over the spectrum too.
Yeah.
So I think it's a very powerful leveling tool in an organization.
Thank you so much for all of that feedback. And I know we have a few moments left, and so I want to open this time up for any additional questions before we have the panelists close out.
I just wanted to say that, when we think about how we're in our companies, preparing for this, and I'm really glad to hear the shout outs for the ERGs because in our company, one of the things that we did, our largest ERG is our parents ERG, family ERG. And and I was the initial executive sponsor for that. One of the things that we did that was an idea of one of our leaders that was so cool was they suggested that one of the challenges with a lot of these things, and in particular was youth mental health, was people managers who don't have children or anything like that are really worried. It's a hard conversation to have, and this was actually because of our Black ERG had done a series like this, which was to bring people managers in and have a space to talk about, how to think about the issues that are being dealt with and sort of train people managers peer to peer in that. And we did one of these sessions around youth mental health by bringing any people managers could come in and just and talk to parents who were dealing with these things. And as them as employees, how to support them. It was one of the best things that we did, and for anybody who has ERGs like that, I really recommend this model of using those at not just to support each other, but for training for people managers in a not a more formal L&D way, but in this informal way. And it was really impactful around this topic. So it's cool to hear that this is really emerging in a lot of companies because I think it's a resource is beneficial across the organization.
What's your company?
Vox Media.
I wanted to thank you for that comment because I think it's spot on. One of the things that we learned during the pandemic is that some of our managers were more nimble and agile and able to adjust than others. And so coming out of that, HR has on our agenda this year basically a reset training for managers. In some ways, it's about upskilling their abilities around hybrid and remote work. and their comfort levels with it. But the other component of that is having a deeper set of compassion and understanding and ease in their skill set to supporting the individual needs of their employees. And we did find that there were a certain number of managers that just didn't know how to do that. They were kind of raised and oriented that their job was in the black and white zone and not so much in the gray zone of leadership. And I think that that's an important initiative in our business for this year.
Well, I'd like everyone to give our amazing panelists a round of applause. And pat yourselves on the back for one, showing up to this summit to learn more and how you can support your colleagues in the workplace and also yourselves. It's been a long 2 years, so pat yourselves on the back, everyone. Doing a great job. Positive affirmation. But thank you so much to our amazing panelists. We're so glad that you joined us, and off we go to lunch or the next breakout. I'll have to look at the schedule.
Thank you. Is it lunch?
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.